They called him Beast. The officer called him worth saving. Neither of them knew the dog would soon decide who deserved mercy, who deserved justice, and what a second chance really costs. By the time Ethan Cole reached the fairgrounds on the outskirts of Amarillo, the day had already soured into one of those dusty Texas evenings that made the whole world look tired. The late sun sagged over the horizon in a copper smear, staining the clouds with the color of old pennies and smoke. Heat still radiated from the dirt, but the wind had begun to change, carrying with it the dry, restless whisper that always came before night in the plains. The fair itself looked like something assembled by men who had stopped caring whether it lasted past sunset. Crooked tents leaned under fraying ropes. Rusted rides groaned without rhythm. Food stalls sweated grease. Children darted through the chaos while their parents pretended not to notice how wrong certain corners of the place felt. Ethan had not come there for entertainment. At 35, he no longer came anywhere for entertainment. He had spent the last 10 years in uniform and the last 3 trying to pretend that grief and duty could coexist without poisoning each other. Most people in Amarillo knew him as the quiet officer who did not take long lunches, who did not laugh in the station break room, and who never stayed after shift for cards or beer. They respected him mostly. Some mistook his silence for arrogance. Others thought it was discipline. The truth was less flattering and more human. Ethan had simply learned that if he did not keep a lid on his emotions, he would start thinking too clearly about the night he found his partner dying in a liquor store aisle, blood running under the refrigerator doors while the freezer motor hummed like nothing important was happening. Daniel Hayes had been 29, fast on his feet, easy smile, a good officer and an even better friend. He had also been the one man Ethan trusted enough to let the mask slip around. When Daniel died, something in Ethan sealed shut. He still did his work. He still answered calls. He still knocked on doors and brought bad news to families when he had to. But when shift ended, he went home to a little white house at the edge of town where the silence sat with him like a second shadow. That afternoon he had driven past the fair twice before finally turning in. Maybe he would have kept driving if not for the crowd. It was gathered around the last booth near the back fence, where the music from the midway thinned and the laughter turned rougher. There was a particular kind of sound that came from people amused by cruelty. Ethan knew it the way a paramedic knows the sound of panic or a detective knows the sound of a lie. It was too loud, too eager, too hungry for something to snap. He parked, stepped out into the dust, and followed it. The cage sat in the center of a ring of boots and cheap excitement. It was welded from thick iron bars and blackened by rust so deep it looked like the metal had bled. Somebody had fixed one corner with chain instead of bolts. At the bottom, the dirt was dark with old waste, overturned water, and the dull stains left behind by neglect. Men stood around it with paper cups of beer, laughing whenever the dog inside threw itself at the bars. The dog was a German shepherd. Or rather, he was what remained of one. He was big enough to remember what strength felt like, but so starved that every rib showed through the matted sable and silver of his coat. Bald patches broke the fur along his shoulders and muzzle. One ear bent halfway over, twisted by an old injury that had healed wrong. A rope of white scar tissue ran down one hind leg where fur no longer grew. His eyes were red-rimmed, bloodshot, and full of something so raw it took Ethan a second to separate the fury from the pain beneath it. Every time the crowd moved too quickly or laughed too loud, the dog lunged and snarled and rattled the whole cage until children squealed and grown men grinned. They called him Beast. They said it like it was funny. A broad man stood beside the cage with one boot propped on a crate, soaking in the attention like a carnival preacher. His name, Ethan learned from the jeers thrown his way, was Roy Haskins. Roy looked exactly like the kind of man who would turn suffering into a side business. He was somewhere in his late 40s, big in the waist, broad in the face, sunburnt, unshaven, and unpleasant in a way that seemed to have matured into identity. A jagged scar cut across his jawline. His checkered shirt was stained dark at the armpits. The suspenders holding up his pants looked ready to surrender. Every time the dog snapped at the bars, Roy smirked as if proud of what fear could still earn him. $100, he yelled to the crowd. That's all I'm a skin. $100 and you get yourself a Real Guard dog. Mean as hell. Meaner than your mother-in-law and twice as loyal. The laughter came again. A drunk in a sweat-stained hat tossed a coin toward the cage just to watch the dog slam forward and snap at it when it hit the dirt. Someone else barked at him. A woman pulled her little boy back with disgust and fascination mixed together. Ethan stopped at the edge of the circle. The dog saw him. First, nothing changed. The shepherd stayed low, hackles up, lips peeled back. But Ethan had spent enough years reading faces, human mostly, but some canine too from working with the K9 unit after Daniel died, to notice what the others missed. The dog's rage was not wild. It was exhausted, defensive, the reaction of something cornered too long. Underneath the growl there was a tremor, almost too small to see, moving through that ruined frame. Not aggression. Collapse held upright by adrenaline. Roy noticed Ethan's badge before he noticed Ethan's expression. "Well, hell," he called out, laughing. "Law finally coming to shut down my little business. Or you shopping too, officer?" Ethan stepped forward until he stood directly in front of the cage. Dust swirled around his boots. The dog went still, not calm but focused now. Their eyes met. Around them the laughter thinned. Ethan crouched slowly, careful, not because he was afraid, but because he knew what it meant to be watched by something that expected pain. The shepherd's chest heaved. His teeth showed. But he did not lunge again. "How much?" Ethan asked without looking away. Roy blinked, surprised. "Didn't you hear me?" "I heard you. $100. The crowd chuckled, waiting for the joke. Ethan slid a hand into his pocket, drew out his wallet, and counted out 5 20s with the same calm he might have used paying for gas. The bills were wrinkled. One corner of the last one had been repaired with tape. He laid them flat on the crate beside Roy. "I'll take him." That shut the crowd up properly. A kid near the back muttered, "No way." One of the farmhands laughed uncertainly, looking around to see whether everyone else knew how to react before he did. Roy squinted at the money, then at Ethan, then at the dog. "You sure you know what you're buying?" Roy asked. "That thing'll rip your hand off first chance it gets." Ethan finally lifted his gaze from the dog to the man. "Then I guess I'll take that risk." The answer landed harder than a speech would have. It had no swagger in it, no posturing, just a tired, dangerous certainty. Roy licked his teeth, then scooped up the cash with thick fingers. "Your funeral," he said. But Ethan had gone back to the dog. Up close, the damage was even worse. The smell rising from the cage was hot metal, dirt, infection, and old blood long dried into fur. Someone had used chain instead of collar at some point. The neck told that story clearly enough. The dog had one eye with a darker ring around it, as if it had taken a hit there more than once. He was not old, not really, but he wore pain like age. "You got a name?" Ethan asked quietly. Roy spat into the dirt. "Beast." Ethan's mouth tightened. "That's not what I asked." The dog's ears twitched. Roy shrugged. "That's what I call him." "Then maybe you never knew him at all." A few people shifted awkwardly at that. Cruelty is easy when it has no language around it. Once someone names it, the room changes. At the edge of the crowd stood a paper-thin boy with a bundle of newspapers tucked under one arm. He could not have been older than 11. Sun-bleached blonde hair. Too large shirt. Freckles scattered across a face that still had baby softness at the edges but already understood worry. Ethan had seen him around town before, weaving between car windows with the evening edition, but he had never spoken to him. The boy was staring at the dog with such solemn intensity that he seemed outside the rest of the crowd entirely. Later Ethan would learn his name was Tommy Reed. In that moment he was simply another witness to whatever choice was being made here. Roy jerked his chin toward the cage door. "You want him? Open it yourself." The chain holding the latch came off with a metallic grind. Inside, the shepherd pressed harder into the back corner, snarling again now that movement had returned. The crowd leaned in, hoping for blood. Ethan ignored them. He crouched lower until he was almost eye level with the dog and extended one empty hand. Not toward the face, not too close, just enough to offer the possibility of a choice. "Easy," he said. "Easy, boy." The dog's growl deepened. Saliva shone at the edges of his teeth. Yet under all of it, Ethan saw the thing that had made him stop at the cage in the first place. The dog wasn't reading him like prey or threat. He was reading him like weather, trying to decide whether this would be one more storm or something stranger. Ethan kept talking. "No one's making you prove anything. No one's hitting you. You don't have to fight me." The crowd shifted again. Somewhere behind Ethan, Roy muttered. Dumbest thing I've seen in 20 years. Then the dog made the smallest sound. Not a growl. Not a bark. A whimper. It was so soft that half the people there probably thought they imagined it. But Ethan heard it. And when he did, everything else about the scene rearranged itself into the truth. This was not a mean dog. This was a broken one. There is a difference, and any man who works around violence long enough learns it. That's right, Ethan whispered. I hear you. The shepherd stared at him, another heartbeat. Then too. His shoulders trembled once. Slowly, dragging the short length of chain attached to his collar, he stood. The crowd went quiet enough to hear the metal links scrape the dirt. The dog stepped forward, one careful paw at a time. He did not put his nose into Ethan's hand. He did not lick it. He simply came close enough to smell him. Sweat, dust, coffee, leather, gun oil. The stubborn steadiness of a man whose pulse had quickened but whose body refused to flinch. Then he stopped. Ethan rose slowly, reached for the collar chain, and clipped his own spare leash to it. The dog stiffened, but he did not snap. Together they stepped out of the cage. The crowd parted without being told. The boy with the newspapers whispered, "Please don't hurt him." Though Ethan could not tell whether he meant himself, the dog, or the whole damn world. By the time Ethan got the shepherd into the back of his truck, the sun had nearly disappeared. Amarillo's outskirts stretched ahead in long dark lines, the fair shrinking behind them into noise and dust and bad memories for sale. In the rearview mirror, Ethan saw the dog watching him through the slats of the temporary crate he had borrowed from one of the stock booths. On the road home, with the last orange light sliding off the plains, Ethan said the first name that came to him. Shadow. The dog blinked once, as if he understood not the word but the gentleness of being addressed as something other than a warning. When Ethan turned onto his road at the edge of town, the sky was fully dark. His little house sat alone enough that the silence felt earned. One story. White paint peeling in strips. A porch that leaned slightly to the left. Dry grass. A chain-link fence that had seen better decades. It was not much, but it was steady, and steady had become a kind of luxury in Ethan's life. He carried the crate into the living room and set it down near the wall beneath the lamp. The moment the crate touched wood, Shadow exploded. He hit the bars with his shoulders, snarling, clawing, the whole structure rocking against the floorboards. Ethan didn't shout, didn't grab, didn't crowd. He simply backed up enough to create space, then crossed to the kitchen, filled a metal bowl with water, another with food, and placed them a few feet from the crate door without trying to coax the dog out. Then he sat on the floor. Most people would have tried obedience first. Command. Dominance. Rules. Ethan knew better than that, maybe because nobody had ever managed to lecture grief out of him either. So he talked. He talked about growing up in Amarillo. About learning to drive on back roads before he had a license. About his mother who sent pies to half the block and his father who believed silence was a form of respect until it wasn't. He talked about becoming a cop because in some naive corner of himself, he had once believed good men with badges could stop bad endings if they just moved fast enough. He talked about Daniel Hayes and how funny Daniel had been and how irritating and how loyal and how the worst thing about grief was that the dead kept staying themselves in your memory, while the world insisted on moving them into the past. As Ethan spoke, Shadow's snarling lessened by degrees. Not much, not quickly, but enough to matter. The dog still trembled. His eyes never left Ethan. His chest rose hard and fast. Yet the full-bodied panic softened into watchfulness. At one point Ethan stopped speaking, and the silence stretched until the dog made a small sound again, less whimper than question. "Yeah," Ethan said quietly. "I know. Hours passed that way." The lamp cast amber over the room. Crickets started up outside. Somewhere down the road an engine coughed and went silent. Ethan's back hurt from sitting on the floor. He stayed there anyway. Trust is expensive. He had learned that from men and now from this dog. Near midnight, a voice split the quiet from outside. "Ethan Cole, what in heaven's name have you dragged into that house?" Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Alice Whitaker lived next door, though next door was generous in a neighborhood where every house seemed to sit with one elbow's worth of privacy and a whole lifetime's worth of opinions. She was 72, sharp-boned, straight-backed despite the years, and as allergic to nonsense as other people were to pollen. Her silver hair lived in a perpetual knot. Her glasses magnified eyes that missed very little and forgave even less. Since her husband Arthur died, she had developed the habit of addressing the entire street as if it were one underperforming classroom. Ethan stepped onto the porch, closing the door behind him. Alice stood at her fence in a robe and house shoes, shawl clutched at her throat like the weather had personally offended her. "It's a dog," Ethan said. "That is not a dog," Alice fired back. "That is bad judgment with teeth. He's hurt." She sniffed. "Hurt things hurt people." The sentence landed harder than she knew. Arthur Whitaker had once tried to tame a stray and gotten mauled for the effort. Alice had never really forgiven the universe for teaching her that fear could be right sometimes. Ethan understood that. He understood being ruled by the one terrible example that proved caution could feel like love. "He won't hurt me," Ethan said. "You can't know that." Ethan glanced toward the door. "Neither can he." Alice stared at him a long moment, something almost thoughtful passing under the usual irritation. Then she shook her head. "Well," she said, "don't say I didn't warn you." Back inside, Shadow had moved closer to the bowls. Not much. Foot maybe, but more than before. Ethan sat again. By 2 in the morning, Shadow had eaten. Not eagerly, not like a healthy dog devouring relief. He had taken the first piece of food one kibble at a time, head low, shoulders braced, as if expecting the meal to come with pain attached. Ethan pretended not to watch, though every nerve in him was fixed on the sound. When the water bowl finally scraped empty enough to ring softly against the floor, Ethan let out the breath he had been holding for half the night. "Good," he murmured. "That's good." The next day, after a sleep too short to matter, Ethan made the mistake of believing the hardest part might be over. It wasn't. In the break room at the station, under lights that made everything look tired and vaguely hostile, Deputy Mark Callahan laughed loud enough for half the room to hear about the fairground devil dog Ethan had supposedly decided to nurse back to life. Mark was the sort of officer every department had at least one of, competent enough to stay employed, loud enough to fill silence, and so deeply devoted to his own certainty that the possibility of being wrong offended him physically. Barrel-chested, sunburned neck, shaved head, immaculate boots. He carried himself like procedure had fathered him. "You actually paid money for that thing?" one rookie asked. Mark slapped the table. $100, I heard. $100 for a dog looks like it died twice and forgot to lie down. A few people laughed. Rosalind Vega did not. Rose was younger than Mark, older than the rookies, and had the kind of stillness that made people underestimate how fast she noticed everything. She stirred cream into her coffee and said without looking up, "Or maybe he saw what the rest of you missed." Mark grinned. "You all getting sentimental now?" Rose took a sip. "No, just observant." Ethan said nothing. He signed out, finished paperwork, and went home. Tommy Reed was waiting by the gate with 2 crusts of bread and a wedge of wrapped cheese. "For the dog," he said quickly, as if embarrassed by generosity. "If he wants it." Ethan took the offering like it was important because it was. "Thanks, Tommy." The boy peered past him into the house. "He doing okay?" "Depends what okay means." Tommy nodded as if he understood that better than most adults did. The storm hit that night. Texas storms did not always announce themselves with rain first. Sometimes they began in electricity, in pressure, in the sensation that the air itself had leaned too close. By evening the wind had changed. By night the first lightning had split the sky clean over the fields beyond Ethan's house. Shadow came apart. 1 boom and he was on his feet. 2 and he was pacing. 3 and he crashed against the window hard enough to rattle the frame. He barked then, not angry, not threatening, but desperate. A sound torn from somewhere older than the cage. Ethan saw it all at once. Whatever Roy Haskins had done to him had involved noise, confinement, maybe violence timed to storms or metal or shouted bets. Trauma doesn't remember chronology. It remembers sensation. "Shadow," Ethan said, staying low. Hey, look at me." The dog spun, sides heaving, eyes wide white at the corners. Another blast of thunder shook the house. Shadow lunged for the wall, claws scraping paint. Ethan did the only thing he could. He sat in the middle of the room and opened both hands. "You're not there," he said softly. "You're here. You're here with me." Rain slammed the roof now. Shadow froze long enough to hear tone if not meaning. He looked at Ethan like a creature standing on the edge of some invisible cliff. Then, trembling so hard it seemed to hurt him, he took one step forward. Then another. He came close enough to smell Ethan's hands. And when the next thunderclap rolled through the walls, Shadow pressed the side of his scarred muzzle into Ethan's palm. Not because he was calm, because he had run out of places to put his fear. Ethan nearly broke then. He kept his hand gentle on the dog's head, fingers barely moving, and whispered the same stupid, useless, holy thing over and over. I know, I know, I know. Outside, on the other side of the chain-link fence, Tommy Reed had stopped his bike in the rain because he had seen the light on and heard the dog barking. He stood there soaked through his red hoodie, watching through the gap in the curtains as the big shepherd finally lowered himself beside the officer, and shook like a child in a nightmare while Ethan stayed with him on the floor. Tommy wiped his eyes with his sleeve and did not understand why he was crying. He pedaled away only when headlights rolled slow past the end of Ethan's road. A truck. Dark. Idling too long. The kind of truck driven by men who came back for what they regretted selling. And inside it, a cigarette ember glowed red in the dark as Roy Haskins watched the little white house, the dog, and the man who had somehow done in one night what cruelty had failed to destroy in years. Ethan thought the storm had ended when Shadow chose his hand over the window. He did not yet know the real danger had been parked beyond the fence, waiting for the dog to become valuable again. Morning arrived washed clean and deceptive. The storm had left behind a sky too blue to trust and a wind that moved through the cottonwoods in long relieved sighs. Ethan stepped onto the porch with coffee in one hand and the leash in the other. He had expected resistance. Maybe another standoff. Maybe a fight to get Shadow past the doorway. Instead, the shepherd followed him cautiously down the steps and into the yard as if some small piece of the night before had convinced him that the world outside did not always end in pain. It was the first walk. Shadow moved low at first, shoulders tight, nose twitching at every scent. Wet dirt, fence posts, motor oil from a passing truck, rabbits in the ditch, bread crusts Tommy had dropped the day before. He registered everything. And every few steps he looked back at Ethan, not quite checking in, not quite doubting, but measuring whether the man was still there. Ethan let the pace stay slow. The road behind the house led toward an open stretch of field and farther on, the abandoned grain mill that marked the edge of the older part of Amarillo. Morning light spread warm over the gravel, and in that golden quiet it became easier to imagine healing as something physical. Something with weight, with breath, with careful repetition. At the far fence line, a pickup roared past and spat dust. Shadow flinched, but he did not bolt. "You're all right," Ethan said. The dog's bent ear twitched. At the station, rumors had already outrun fact. By noon, the story of Ethan buying a mad dog from a fairground cage had grown into 6 different versions depending on who told it. In one, the dog had killed 3 men in another county. In another, Ethan had adopted him as some kind of guilt ritual because he still couldn't get over Daniel Hayes. Mark Callahan treated the whole thing like a running comedy set. But Rosalind Vega had other instincts. She came by Ethan's desk that afternoon with a folder tucked under one arm and said quietly, "Take him to Hannah Mercer." Ethan looked up. Why? Because if that dog's as scarred as people say, then some of those injuries weren't accidents. And Hannah's the only vet in town who documents abuse like she's building a murder case. Dr. Hannah Mercer ran a small practice at the edge of town with one exam room that still smelled faintly of hay because half her clients were ranchers and the other half were people who loved things other folks thought were disposable. She was in her early 40s, compact and sun-browned, with dark curls always escaping whatever tie she tried to contain them with. She had once worked emergency veterinary trauma in Dallas, but came back to Amarillo after her father's stroke and never left. Practical hands, direct eyes, little patience for cruelty or performative emotion. She let Shadow set the terms. That was the first good sign. The dog entered the exam room stiff and alert, but Hannah didn't reach for him. She sat on the floor 3 yards away, cross-legged in old jeans and a denim shirt, and talked about absolutely nothing important while Ethan stood nearby with the leash loose in his hand. "People always think trust starts with touching," she said. "Usually it starts with not touching." Shadow watched her, sniffed the air, took one step, then another. By the time she finally got her hands on him, gently, methodically, He was trembling but allowing it. The report she built made Ethan's stomach go hard. Old healed fractures in 2 ribs. Scarring around the neck consistent with prolonged chain abrasion. Burn-like tissue pattern along one flank. Teeth worn in a way that suggested repeated biting against metal or restraint. Signs of prolonged malnutrition. Evidence of trauma conditioning. She found a microchip too, though the numbers had been partially scraped, as if someone had tried to erase the registration without removing the chip completely. This dog wasn't just neglected, Hannah said quietly, reading the radiographs clipped up to the light. He was used. Ethan leaned on the counter. For fighting. She didn't answer right away, which was answer enough. Maybe, she said at last. Or baiting. Or intimidation. Or some sadistic combination men invent when ordinary cruelty stops entertaining them. But none of this happened by chance. She handed him the written report. Keep that. If somebody ever comes looking for him, you're going to need more than your word. As if summoned by the warning itself, Roy Haskins returned to Amarillo's Edge in whispers before he returned in person. Tommy saw his truck twice in 1 week. The first time it idled near the feed store. The second time it slowed by Ethan's road at dusk and kept going when Tommy stepped off the bike path and stared too long. The boy reported both sightings in the solemn, urgent way kids sometimes do when they know adults are balancing disbelief and danger. It was him, Tommy said. The fair man. Ethan believed him. But belief and proof are not the same thing. He could do little except document, watch, and keep Shadow close. Meanwhile, something else started happening. The town saw the dog. Not the cage. Not the rumor. The dog. It happened in pieces. A slow morning walk down the field road where old Mrs. Whitaker, Alice now, though she was not yet ready for friendship, watched through her curtains instead of shutting them. A stop outside Dina's diner where the waitress left a biscuit on a napkin near Ethan's coffee, and Shadow took it with such care that the whole counter fell quiet for a beat. A little girl at the hardware store who dropped a wrench with a clatter, and then laughed in surprise when Shadow looked at the noise but did not react. Then came the bottle. The air that afternoon was dry enough to crack lips and short tempers. Ethan was walking Shadow past the row of small shops near Wheeler's grain mill when a man came staggering out of the liquor store with that mean, unstable looseness that announces trouble a split second before it becomes action. He was drunk enough to shout and sober enough to aim. "Filthy mutt," he snarled, hurling a bottle. It smashed against the fence post beside Ethan's shoulder. Shadow launched forward instantly. Gasps came from the cafe patio. Somebody cursed. Ethan's pulse hit hard, but his voice stayed level. "Shadow." "No." The dog stopped 3 feet in front of the drunk man. Not because he lacked rage. Ethan could see it burning through the raised hackles and the tight line of his shoulders. But he stopped. Ethan took one careful step forward. "Sit." A beat passed. Then Shadow sat. Still staring. Still alert. Still a wall between Ethan and the threat. The drunk backed away first. Not the officer. Not the dog. And for everyone watching from the patio, the myth cracked. A monster does not stop mid-charge because the man he trusts asked him to. Deputy Mark Callahan had seen the whole thing from across the road where he'd paused with coffee in hand. He approached afterward with unusual quiet, boots crunching gravel, eyes not on Ethan but on Shadow. The dog held still under the scrutiny. Mark scratched the side of his jaw. "I thought you were out of your mind," he said. Ethan gave a humorless smile. "Still possible." Mark's gaze stayed on Shadow. "Maybe, but not about him." He walked away after that, but the shift mattered. Because towns are not changed by speeches. They are changed by witnesses. Alice Whitaker remained unconvinced the longest. Not because she was cruel. Because fear had lived with her too long to be dismissed by one good afternoon. She still crossed her arms when Ethan and Shadow passed her porch. Still pretended not to soften when Tommy stopped by with scraps and stories. Still addressed Shadow indirectly as "that animal," as if naming him might require admitting she'd been wrong. Then her house caught fire. It started just after dusk on a night when the wind came down hot and wrong from the south. Later, people would say it was an electrical short in the backroom lamp. Others would whisper about faulty wiring. Tommy, who was delivering papers at the far end of the road, swore he saw a truck turn out of Alice's drive 10 minutes before the smoke showed. A dark truck. Ethan heard her scream from his porch. By the time he reached the house, flames had already eaten through the curtains in the front room and smoke was pouring from the eaves. Neighbors gathered uselessly on the road, half-dressed, shouting contradictory advice to no one in particular. Ethan didn't stop to think. He kicked the door once, twice. It gave. Heat slammed into him like a wall. Smoke rolled low and black. He dropped to a crouch and shouted Alice's name, but the house answered only in crackling wood and the hiss of burning plaster. Then Shadow ran past him. The dog disappeared into the smoke so fast Ethan only saw the flash of his coat and the rigid drive of his body. For one terrible second, panic spiked straight through Ethan's chest. Then from somewhere deeper in the house came a sharp bark. He followed it. The hallway ceiling had started to bow. A shelf had collapsed in the front room. Alice lay pinned partly beneath it, unconscious, one hand stretched toward the hearth where a framed photograph had fallen face down into ash. Shadow was already at her side. He had taken her sweater gently in his mouth and was trying to pull. Ethan dragged the shelf aside, coughing hard enough to black out at the edges, then got Alice under the shoulders and hauled her toward the door. Shadow darted ahead, then doubled back. Another bark. Ethan looked where the dog was looking and saw the photograph. Alice and her late husband, Arthur, young and smiling in black and white. Even in fire, people reach for what they can't bear to lose twice. Shadow snatched the frame in his jaws and ran beside them through the smoke. When they burst onto the lawn, the neighbors cried out as one body. Ethan collapsed to one knee with Alice in his arms. Shadow dropped the picture beside her and stood there singed, sides heaving, fur along one flank blistered from heat. Alice woke to the sight of him first. Her eyes fluttered, then focused, then filled. He had the photograph. The one thing in that room she would have run back for if she'd had the strength. She lifted a shaking hand to his face. "You're no monster," she whispered. Tommy, standing barefoot in the grass with his phone out because kids now filmed everything by reflex, caught the whole thing. Shadow and Soot. Ethan on one knee. Alice's hand against the dog's burned cheek. By morning the video had traveled farther than any rumor. Amarillo Beast Dog saves woman from fire, one caption read. Another got it closer. Everyone called him dangerous until he ran into flames. The town changed after that in ways both small and irreversible. Dina at the diner stopped leaving one biscuit and started leaving two. The hardware store owner waved them in. Children asked to pet Shadow and were taught, by Ethan patiently repeatedly, how to offer a hand and respect the dog's choice. Even Alice, still smelling faintly of smoke and oxygen tanks for a week after, sent over a pie and claimed it was for the officer, then broke the crust herself and fed the first bite to Shadow. Roy Haskins saw the video too. He arrived 4 days later in a black truck and a leather jacket, carrying a manila envelope and a smile so false it almost deserved applause. Shadow saw him first. The dog had been resting on the porch, bandages fresh on his side, when the truck pulled up. He rose without a sound, moved in front of Ethan, and let out a growl so deep it vibrated through the porch boards. Roy climbed out slow, like a man entering a saloon where he had every intention of being recognized. "Evenin', officer," he said. "Looks like my dog got himself famous." Ethan stayed where he was. "You lost." Roy tossed the envelope at his feet. Papers slid half out. Microchip claim. Ownership transfer. Bought and paid for. That dog's mine. Ethan didn't need long to see the fraud. Wrong dates. Sloppy signature. Registration number that didn't match Hannah's partial chip record. But Roy wasn't here because he expected the papers to survive scrutiny. He was here because public cruelty becomes private greed the moment it realizes kindness has increased the market value. "He's not going with you," Ethan said. Roy's smile hardened. "That ain't your call." Shadow's growl intensified. Roy looked at the dog with naked disgust. "See? Mean as ever." "No," Ethan said. "Just remembers you." The court hearing at Town Hall came fast because Hannah Mercer filed her abuse report the same morning Roy filed his claim. Suddenly it wasn't just a property dispute. It was a question of documented cruelty, forged paperwork, and whether a man who starved a dog nearly to death could reassert ownership because the dog had become locally beloved. Judge Margaret Howell presided out of the municipal courtroom with the kind of unimpressed authority that made loud men shrink despite themselves. She was short, silver-haired, clear-eyed, and carried the mood of a grandmother who had read enough legal filings to recognize when nonsense had been dressed in official language. Roy brought a slick lawyer. Ethan brought the truth. Hannah testified first, clinical and devastating, malnutrition, scar patterns, trauma indicators, likely abuse. In my professional opinion, she said, returning this animal to the claimant would be returning him to the source of documented harm. Tommy testified next because the judge allowed it after seeing the fire video and hearing that the boy had been present at the fair. He stood on the witness step barely high enough to make the microphone like him, voice shaking at first and then steadying as soon as he started talking about the cage. He wasn't mean, Tommy said. He was scared. And Mr. Ethan was the first person who talked to him like he mattered. A courtroom full of adults went quiet enough to hear their own regret. Alice Whitaker came in with her oxygen line, her back straighter than usual from indignation. She looked Roy Haskins dead in the face and said, "That dog walked into fire for me. I have known cruel men longer than you have, Mr. Haskins. I know exactly what one looks like." Even Mark Callahan stood up in the back and admitted, grudgingly, that he had witnessed the liquor store incident and Shadow's response to command had been more disciplined than half the men he'd worked with. Judge Howell reviewed the papers, looked at Roy, looked at Ethan, then looked at the dog himself, sitting silent at Ethan's side. "Mr. Haskins," she said, "property claims fail when the property in question has been criminally neglected, fraudulently documented, and subsequently rehabilitated under lawful care. This court does not return living creatures to prove an abuse." Claim denied. Roy flushed crimson. The judge didn't stop there. She referred Hannah's findings and the forged documents to the county prosecutor for animal cruelty and fraud review. Roy stood too fast, chair scraping. His lawyer caught his sleeve. Too late. The whole room had seen the flash of rage on his face when he looked at Shadow, and it was no longer the rage of a man denied merchandise. It was personal. As he passed Ethan on the way out, Roy leaned in just enough to keep the words from carrying. "If I can't make money off that dog," he said softly, "nobody will." Then he smiled for the hall cameras like a man leaving a church picnic. That night the house felt wrong before Ethan knew why. Shadow sensed it first. He paced the porch once, sniffed the wind, refused dinner. Tommy, on his way home from dropping off an extra newspaper, saw a dark truck parked beyond the tree line and pedaled hard toward Ethan's place to warn him. He was too late. The power went out at 9:14. The back shed went up in a burst of orange a minute later. Not a real blaze, just enough flame to drag Ethan off the porch with a bucket and a hose and 5 urgent seconds of divided attention. That was all Roy needed. By the time Ethan got back to the front yard, Shadow was gone. The porch rail still swung from where the leash had been looped. One of the planks bore the scratch marks of claws fighting drag. A small tranquilizer dart lay in the dirt near the steps, its metal catching the last of the firelight from the shed. Tommy skidded into the drive on his bike, breathless, eyes wide with terror. "Mr. Ethan, truck, black truck." It went toward Wheeler's Mill. Ethan did not answer right away. He crouched in the porch light, picked up the dart, and felt something cold and old crack open under his ribs. The same helpless fury. The same knowledge that something loyal had been taken because men believed love made it vulnerable. Then he stood. "Go get Alice," he told Tommy, voice gone flat with control. "Tell her to call Rose Vega and Mark Callahan. Now." Tommy stared. "What about Shadow?" Ethan's gaze lifted toward the dark road leading out of town. "I'm bringing him home." The dog had survived the cage, the storm, the fire, and the courtroom. But somewhere beyond Amarillo's sleeping streets, the man who broke him was waiting to finish what cruelty had started, and this time Shadow would not be facing him alone. Wheeler's grain mill had been dead for 15 years. It sat beyond the last useful road on a stretch of scrubland where barbed wire fences sagged and the wind seemed to remember names nobody living still spoke. In daylight the place looked merely abandoned. At night it looked cursed. The main structure rose black against the stars, all weathered timber and rusted corrugated metal, its broken silos leaning like old teeth. Locals used it as a landmark when giving directions and a threat when scaring children. Go too far past the county line and you'll hit Wheelers. Keep going and you'll find trouble. Ethan knew that if Roy Haskins was taking Shadow anywhere to disappear him, it would be somewhere exactly like this. By the time Rosalind Vega's truck pulled into Ethan's yard, Alice had already called half the county with more urgency than the sheriff's dispatcher. Tommy was white-faced with fear and fury, and Mark Callahan had arrived still buckling his belt, expression harder than Ethan had ever seen it. "What VE we got?" Mark asked. Ethan held up the dart. "Sedative. Truck went east." Tommy saw it. Tommy nodded so hard it looked painful. "Toward the mill." "I know it was him." Rose took the dart, sniffed once, and grimaced. "Animal tranquilizer. Fast acting." Mark stared toward the dark. "Roy's not dumb enough to do this alone." "No," Ethan said. "He isn't." Alice, wrapped in a cardigan over her nightdress and looking furious enough to set the road on fire herself, spoke from the porch steps. "Arthur used to say Roy ran dogs out there on weekends before the county cracked down. Men would come from 3 towns over. Cash only. No lights." Ethan turned. "You never said that." "You never asked," Alice snapped. Then softer because fear had finally outrun pride. "Bring him back." Rose keyed her radio and requested quiet backup under a welfare check code that would not spook half the department into noise. Mark pulled his cruiser around. Ethan grabbed his service jacket, a flashlight, extra cuffs, and the old leather lead Shadow had learned to trust. Tommy caught his sleeve. "I'm coming." "No. I can show you the shortcut through the wash. You lose 10 minutes on the county road." Ethan looked down at the boy. Dirty sneakers. Tear-bright eyes. Hands clenched at his sides hard enough to shake. The right answer was no. The real answer lived somewhere murkier, in the knowledge that Tommy knew this land, had seen the truck, and would probably follow anyway if told to stay. Rose solved it for him. "He rides with me," she said. "He stays in the truck unless I say otherwise." Tommy nodded like a soldier receiving rank. They drove without sirens. The road out to Wheelers narrowed from asphalt to gravel to packed dirt, and the night pressed closer with every mile. Mesquite scratched the undercarriages. Moonlight pooled pale in the dry wash beyond the fence line. Somewhere out in the dark a coyote called and was answered farther off. Ethan rode shotgun in Mark's cruiser, jaw locked, one hand closed around Shadow's leather lead so tight the stitching bit into his palm. He had failed Daniel once. That sentence had lived like rot under too many of his thoughts. He was not failing Shadow. At the edge of the property they killed the engines and got out. There were vehicles already there. 3, maybe 4. Parked behind the main mill where the old loading dock still offered partial cover. No lights, but low voices carried on the wind. Men laughing. Metal clanging. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked once and was abruptly silenced. Ethan's stomach dropped. Not just Shadow. Others. Rose guided Tommy behind a fuel tank and gave him a look sharper than a knife. "Stay." The boy swallowed and nodded. Mark and Ethan moved first, flanking the sidewall while Rose circled toward the rear doors to cover exit routes. 2 county deputies would be 5 minutes out if the radio gods were kind and the roads were empty. 5 minutes can be an eternity when a frightened dog is sedated in the hands of men who measure worth in suffering. The first thing Ethan smelled when they reached the wall was bleach. Not for cleaning. For hiding blood. The second thing he heard was Roy's voice. "Wake him up," Roy said from inside. "If they want the hero dog, I'll show him what the hero dog does when you remind him who he belongs to." Ethan went cold. Through a broken slat in the wall he could see part of the main interior floor. Flood lamps rigged off a generator. Folding chairs. Makeshift pens. Men in caps and work boots. Cash-changing hands. A ring in the middle built from livestock fencing. And beyond it, against the far wall, 3 crates. One of them moved. Shadow. He was inside, still half groggy from the tranquilizer, but awake enough to press himself against the bars and search the air. Even from this distance, Ethan knew the shape of that tension. The battle between sedation and instinct, fear and memory, survival and learned obedience. Another dog lay in the crate beside him, smaller, limping, eyes hollow. There were others too in wire pens along the sidewall. Roy hadn't just taken Shadow back. He'd taken him home to the business. Mark saw it too and muttered, "Jesus." Roy stood in the center of the ring like a preacher waiting for ties. He had changed shirts. Washed his face. combed his greasy hair back. Respectable by his own standards. Men like that loved performance. Violence bored them unless it had an audience. "We go loud now," Mark whispered. Ethan shook his head. "Not yet. Shadow's too close to the line. If somebody panics, he gets shot first." Mark hated the answer because it was right. Then from the far side of the building came a soft metallic ping. Not loud, not obviously a mistake, but enough to shift heads. "Tommy." Rose's curse cut through Ethan's radio earpiece a second later. Kid moved. Before Ethan could turn, a man inside barked, "Who's there?" Flashlight swung. Everything accelerated. Tommy, trying to crawl closer for a better look, or perhaps because 11-year-old courage does not yet fully understand mortality, had knocked an old feed pan loose behind the outer wall. One of Roy's men headed toward the rear exit with a flashlight and a pistol. Rose intercepted him in the doorway, slammed his wrist into the frame, and sent the gun skidding into the dirt. The shot it fired into the air detonated the whole night. "Sheriff's Department," Mark roared as he burst through the side door with Ethan at his shoulder. "Hands where we can see them." Chaos answered. Chairs crashed. Men bolted. Somebody kicked the generator line and half the flood lamps went dark, leaving the ring in a strobe of shadow and yellow spill. One dog began barking hysterically. Another whined. Roy turned, saw Ethan, and his face went from surprise to hatred in a single ugly motion. "You," he spat. Then he grabbed the nearest crate latch. "Shadows." The dog stumbled out, still unsteady, and Roy looped a catchpole around his neck before Ethan crossed half the floor. "Back off," Roy shouted, hauling hard. "Back off or I break his damn windpipe." Ethan stopped. Every muscle in his body wanted motion, force, endings. But Shadow was caught in the steel loop, front paws braced, chest heaving, one wrong move away from damage his throat might not recover from. The room held. Even the gamblers froze, some on their knees, some with hands half raised, all suddenly aware this had ceased being entertainment. Shadow saw Ethan. That mattered. Across the ring, in the noise, in the smell of bleach and fear and old blood, the dog found him. His eyes locked onto Ethan's face the same way they had through the fairground cage, through the storm, through the porch light when a hand had finally meant comfort. Sedation still dragged at him, but recognition cut through it. Ethan lowered his weapon. "Shadow," he said, voice steady enough to build a bridge on. "Look at me." Roy jerked the pole. "Shut up." Shadow choked, coughed, but kept his eyes on Ethan. "That's it," Ethan said. "Stay with me." Roy laughed, breathless and hateful. "You think he's yours?" "He's what I made him." "No," Ethan said. "He's what you failed to destroy." A county deputy rushed one of the side exits. A gambler swung at Mark and got dropped. Rose shouted that she had two in custody. Somewhere outside, sirens finally rose. Roy's control cracked. He jammed a hand into his jacket and pulled out a revolver. Not at Ethan. At Shadow. If he couldn't own the dog, he meant to prove ownership one last time through ruin. Ethan moved on instinct. So did Shadow. The dog twisted under the catchpole with a force nobody in that room expected from a half-sedated, injured shepherd. He dropped one shoulder, let the loop slip just enough across the scar tissue at his neck, and launched low into Roy's legs at the exact moment Ethan lunged across the ring. The shot fired into the roof. Metal screamed. Dust rained down. Roy fell backward into the fence and the catchpole clattered free. Ethan hit him a second later, both of them crashing through a folding table in a shower of cash, glass, and curses. Shadow staggered 2 steps, coughed once, then went not to Roy but to the side pens. He started barking. Not in rage. In command. Other dogs answered, thin, frightened, half-broken sounds. Ethan, pinning Roy's wrist while Mark ripped the gun away, saw it then. Shadow wasn't finished with his own rescue. He had pivoted instantly to the others. "Rose!" Ethan shouted. "Get those crates open." Rose was already there. One by one the pins came undone. A brindled hound too scared to stand. A shepherd mix with one eye clouded over. A pit bull scarred with old chain marks. 2 young dogs not yet ruined beyond trembling. Men who had come to bet money on blood now lay on the ground cuffed while the creatures they had used blinked into open space like survivors surfacing from underwater. Roy kept fighting until Mark drove a knee into his back and snapped cuffs over both wrists. "This ain't over," Roy spat, face in the dirt. Mark hauled him up. "For you it is. It might have ended cleanly there if not for the fire." Some idiot, scrambling, kicked the overturned lantern that had been lighting the bookkeeper's table. Oil spread under splintered wood. Flame found hay, old sacks, dry beams, and in a structure abandoned for 15 years that was all it needed. "Fire!" Rose yelled. Smoke rolled fast along the rafters. The deputies began hauling suspects out. Tommy, who had now disobeyed every order ever given to him by every adult present and slipped inside during the chaos, stood frozen near the rear pen staring at a crate where one of the younger dogs had collapsed too weak to move. "Tommy!" Ethan shouted. The boy turned too late to avoid a falling beam. It slammed down between him and the exit in a burst of sparks and burning wood. Shadow moved first. Of course he did. He bolted through the smoke, leapt the low flame line, and reached Tommy in 2 strides. The boy dropped to his knees beside the crate, coughing, trying with shaking fingers to lift the latch. Shadow shoved his muzzle under the edge, growled, and heaved. The latch snapped. The young dog inside dragged itself free just as Ethan crashed over the fallen beam and wrapped an arm around Tommy's chest. "Out!" he shouted. Tommy grabbed the crate dog with both arms. Ethan took the boy. Shadow herded them all toward the open side door through smoke thick enough to blind a man but not a dog with something left to protect. They burst out into cold night air a second before the interior roof gave with a thunderclap of collapsing timber. Tommy hit the dirt hard, still clutching the trembling young dog. He coughed, cried once from sheer adrenaline, and then laughed in that unhinged, grateful way children sometimes do when terror realizes it has lost. Ethan dropped beside Shadow. The shepherd's breathing was ragged. Soot clung to his coat. His neck was raw where the catchpole had scraped old scar against new pain. But he was alive. Watching. Present. "You stupid brave animal," Ethan whispered, hands shaking now that shaking was allowed. "I told you I was bringing you home." Shadow leaned forward and pushed his soot-black muzzle into Ethan's chest. Around them, the mill burned, sirens screamed, and other deputies dragged out the last suspects while Hannah Mercer, because Rose had thought to call her the moment she heard dogs, arrived in the back of an animal control van commandeered for mercy rather than transport. She moved from dog to dog with triage speed and fury in equal measure. By dawn, Roy Haskins's dogfighting and trafficking operation had become the kind of news Amarillo could not swallow quietly. The mill yielded ledgers, betting books, old photographs, veterinary black market supplies, and enough evidence to turn Roy's cruelty from rumor into record. The fire, ironically, had preserved more than it destroyed because men like Roy never believe their own empire can fall in one night. They store proof as if permanence were their birthright. Shadow rode to Hannah's clinic in Ethan's truck with 3 rescued dogs in crates behind him and Tommy in the passenger seat wrapped in Alice Whitaker's blanket because the old woman had shown up at the fire scene in slippers and refused to go home until she saw the boy alive. "Don't you ever do that again," she told Tommy while dabbing soot from his forehead. "I am too old for this level of nonsense." Tommy nodded with all the sincerity a child can manage when he has absolutely no intention of becoming less brave. The days after the raid unfolded like a town waking up with clearer eyes. Roy went to county lockup first, then state holding, then into the long, joyless machinery of prosecution where men who profit from cruelty learn that paperwork can wound too. Several of his associates cut deals. Others didn't get the option. Hannah coordinated rescue for the surviving dogs. Rose handled evidence as if she were laying bricks for a monument. Mark Callahan, to his own astonishment, became one of the loudest voices arguing for stricter enforcement on animal fighting cases because once a man has seen the pens for himself, some jokes stop being possible. Alice Whitaker made pie for the volunteers and never once called Shadow that animal again. Tommy started spending every spare afternoon at Hannah's clinic and every spare evening on Ethan's porch, where he read the paper aloud to Shadow and the recovering dogs like a broadcaster with the most important audience in Texas. 1 week later, under a sky scrubbed clear by autumn wind, Judge Margaret Howell signed the final guardianship papers permanently placing Shadow in Ethan Cole's care and commended the department, not that she did it gracefully, for the rescue operation at Wheeler's Mill. The courtroom was fuller than before. Not because people liked legal proceedings, because people like witnessing redemption when it becomes undeniable. When Ethan stepped outside, reporters wanted quotes. He gave them very little. "He's a good dog," he said. "That's the whole story." It wasn't, of course, but it was the part he most wanted preserved. The town did the rest. There was talk of medals, a plaque, a ceremony. Ethan would have refused all of it if Tommy had not looked so heartbreakingly proud at the suggestion that Shadow might finally be known for what he was instead of what people once called him. So the ceremony happened. Not huge, not ridiculous. Just a modest gathering on the courthouse lawn where the mayor shook Ethan's hand. Hannah stood beside the rescued dogs, now clean and healing. Alice sat in the front row with a blanket over her knees. Mark Callahan pretended not to be emotional and failed, and Tommy read from a piece of notebook paper in a voice that shook only once. "They used to call him Beast," Tommy said, looking down at Shadow where the dog sat beside Ethan with a calm no cage had earned and no crowd could take away. "But I think people only say that when they're scared of looking at pain too closely." Mr. Ethan looked anyway. And because he did, Shadow saved more than one life. He saved a whole bunch. Maybe even ours. Not many speeches ever deserve silence afterward. That one did. Months later, when the last court date had passed and the last rescued dog from Roy's Mill had been placed or fostered, Ethan built something beside his little house at the edge of Amarillo. Not a kennel. Not a cage. A haven. Cedar walls. Sloped roof. Low window facing the field road. A bed inside layered with old army blankets and a thick wool rug. Tommy helped paint the trim. Alice contributed a quilt for winter and don't argue. Hannah dropped off a tin sign with the name burned into it by hand. Shadow's watch. When Ethan stepped back from the finished structure and wiped the sawdust from his hands, Shadow approached slowly, nose working, ears flicking. He sniffed the threshold, entered, turned once, and lay down in the center of the room with a long exhale that sounded almost like acceptance becoming peace. Tommy beamed. "He likes it." Ethan smiled. "Yeah, he does." By then Shadow moved differently. Not because his scars had vanished. They hadn't. The bent ear remained. The leg still stiffened in cold weather. The flank where fire kissed him and the neck where chains had eaten into him would always tell versions of the story his body survived. But his eyes had changed. The constant edge of panic was gone. He rested now with true weight in his body. He slept. He played sometimes, clumsy and cautious, and then with sudden flashes of joy that seemed to embarrass him afterward. He allowed Alice to scratch behind his good ear. He took sandwiches from Tommy with exquisite care. He walked with Ethan through town and no one crossed the street anymore. One evening, as the light went gold across the fields and the wind moved gentle through the grass, Ethan sat on the porch steps with coffee in hand and watched Tommy attempt to teach one of the younger rescued dogs to fetch something besides the same stick it kept losing. Alice sat nearby in her cardigan pretending not to smile. Mark stopped by in his cruiser under the excuse of a patrol check and stayed for coffee. Rose leaned on the porch rail and asked Tommy whether he planned on becoming canine or detective. "Canine," Tommy said instantly. "You gotta earn trust first." Ethan looked at him, then at Shadow lying with his head across Ethan's boot. "That's right," he said softly. "That's the whole job." When the others left and the stars came out one by one over Amarillo, Ethan stayed on the steps a while longer. The porch light cast amber over the yard. Crickets sang. Somewhere far off a train whistle cut through the dark like an old memory refusing to fully disappear. He leaned down and rested a hand against Shadow's head. "You remember the cage?" he asked. Shadow lifted his eyes. Ethan shook his head. "Stupid question. Of course you do." The dog said nothing, because dogs do not grant us the relief of language. They grant us something harder and truer. Presence. "Wait. The choice to stay." Ethan looked out at the fence line where Tommy's bike tracks still marked the dirt, and at Alice's window glowing warm next door, and at the little cedar shelter standing solid beside the house. "They called you Beast," he murmured. "Turns out they were looking at the wrong creature all along." Shadow shifted closer and laid his head fully in Ethan's lap. It was not submission. It was trust. Deep, hard-earned, and freely given. Ethan closed his eyes for a moment and let himself feel the size of what that meant. Not because he had saved the dog all by himself. No one saves anything all by themselves. Tommy's tenderness had mattered. Alice's changed heart had mattered. Hannah's records and Rosa's instinct and even Mark's eventual willingness to stand up and be wrong had mattered. Healing is rarely one grand act. Usually it is a town full of smaller acts finally choosing not to look away. Still, the first act had belonged to him. He had looked into a rusted cage and refused the easy story. He had paid $100 not for a dangerous animal, but for a chance. And in return, that chance had become a dog who walked into flame, stood between violence and the vulnerable, dragged truth out of men who profited from pain, and turned a lonely officer's silent house into a place where laughter now lived. The wind moved soft across the porch. Shadow sighed. Somewhere in the dark, life went on with all its ordinary noises, the little ones people miss when they are too busy grieving, surviving, or proving themselves right. Ethan sat with his hand in the dog's fur and thought that maybe second chances never arrive looking noble. Maybe they arrive filthy, furious, half-starved, and impossible to love without courage. Maybe that is exactly why they matter. Tommy came back the next afternoon with a hand-painted board for the fence. He held it up proudly. No broken things are thrown away here. Alice cried when she saw it and denied it immediately. Mark laughed until he noticed nobody else was laughing at the sentiment, and then cleared his throat and said it was decent work for a kid. Ethan nailed the sign to the fence himself. Shadow watched from the porch. And when Ethan stepped back and looked at the house, the yard, the shelter, the sign, the neighbor next door, the boy at the gate, and the dog who had once been reduced to a cage and a cruel nickname, he understood something that would have sounded sentimental if anyone else had said it aloud. Home is not where nothing bad ever happened. Home is where bad things no longer get the final word. Shadow rose, crossed the yard, and stopped in front of the new sign as if inspecting it. Tommy laughed. Alice pressed a handkerchief to her nose. Ethan felt the smile come before he could stop it. "Yeah," he said. "That's you." The dog glanced back at him, and in that look was the whole story. Not beast, not weapon, not problem, chosen. If miracles exist, they do not always arrive with light from heaven or choirs in the distance. Sometimes they come in the form of a scarred shepherd under a rusted fairground tarp. Sometimes they come disguised as a tired cop with a wrinkled $100 bill in his wallet and enough loneliness in him to recognize another wounded soul on sight. Sometimes they come as a newspaper boy with bread crusts in his pocket, an old woman brave enough to change her mind, and a town slowly learning that mercy is not weakness. And sometimes the greatest miracle of all is this: that what was once caged can become guardian, that what was once feared can become beloved, and that what was once broken can still somehow choose love, because Shadow did. And after everything men had done to him, that may have been the bravest thing in Texas.